Morning, everyone. Hope you're all doing okay. This is part two of World War II. I call it the Tide Turns, winning the war. It says Allied victories, mostly thanks to the U.S., although the Soviet Union had a hand in this as well, obviously pushing the Germans back to Berlin at the latter part of the war in 1945. But we're focusing on the American aspect of this, so some of this you may have heard of before. Um, some of it you may not have. So we have early Allied efforts in 1942. Like I said in the last video, the early years of the war were Axis victories with the Blitzkrieg and this German technique of lightning strikes made it very difficult for the Allies to fight back. There was a bombing of London, and so Britain was very much in need of aid. There was in the Japanese side, on the Western Front of the war, there was something called the Doolittle Raid in 1942, which is U.S. aid in Japan that actually didn't achieve that much. Not a lot of casualties. Most of it was just kind of to boost morale. It did boost morale for the war effort, but it was colloquially known as the Doolittle Raid because nothing much had happened because of this Doolittle Raid. This is a morale booster, at least on the part of the United States, in the early years of the war, just after Pearl Harbor. Um, the U.S. was oddly successful in fighting a two-front war. I mean, you had Germany fighting a two-front war, and it ultimately collapsed because of his fighting a two-front war. The United States was able to fight a two-front war, and the question historians will ask would be why this is the case. And it had to do with the economic might of the United States. So here's just an overview of how America was able to fight this battle, these two front wars. Um, uh, we had talked about how it equipped allies with weapons through the Lend-Lease program, a way of getting around the Neutrality Acts that Congress had passed to keep America isolated. So the U.S. was taking sides initially, but it had the power to make weapons and, of course, lend them out. With the idea that they would be returned, of course, this is kind of a silly idea because few people want their weapons back after they're already used. So they're able to do that. The other big thing we'll talk about, excuse me, talk a little bit about today is the Manhattan Project, the development of the atomic bomb. Um, very expensive. This cost several $billions. In this day and age, that would have been a lot of money. That would have been a sizable chunk of the economy. The United States was able to pay for this. Germany was experimenting with research with coming up with the atomic bomb, but the United States beat them to it because we had the resources to do so. There was very little rationing in the U.S. If you talk to your grandparents, great grandparents, they might remember, well, there was rationing. But it wasn't anything like what you had in other countries during the war, European countries during the war. So, U.S. Had a little bit of this. Speed limits to preserve gas are instituted. Tires and nylon are rationed, and you would think nylon would be kind of strange, but they use nylons for parachutes, things like this. So nylon was rationed. Tires, of course, being rationed, and then you had something called Meatless Tuesdays, so preserving meat for the soldiers on the front. Meatless Tuesdays. But there was some rationing, but not a lot of rationing. And of course, the economic might of the United States during World War II, the production of weapons, aided the Great Depression. So the New Deal, it's debatable whether that was extending the Depression and actually bringing it to an end. I mean, there are some historians disagree on this, but the World War II does end the Great Depression. There's actually a workforce shortage at the beginning of the war. Now, this is just unheard of because there was nobody had a job during the 1930s. I mean, there was a huge unemployment rate, 25% at the highest. So now you have World War One. There's actually a World War Two. Excuse me. You have this incredible worker shortage because all the men are off to war. So a lot of companies are hiring women in these traditionally masculine roles, like usually factory work, building machinery. So you have the idea of Rosie the Riveter, which you got a picture of here. You've got a famous figure on the left, We Can Do It, and then you've got the Norman Rockwell, Rosie the Riveter on the right with the jackhammer eating the sandwich. Probably working on a ship with the American flag in the background. So hiring women, this became sort of a symbol of not only femininity but of national strength. Rosie the Riveter, and then you had they were making Liberty ships, something called Liberty ships, and Liberty ships were like ready-made battleships. So usually battleships took several months to build, sometimes years to build. So countries didn't tend to have a lot of them. Well, the United States developed this plan by using the factory process, the assembly line process. These were prefabricated ships, and so they were a little cheaper. They were seaworthy, but you could put them together in a matter of weeks. I think some propaganda videos had putting them together in a matter of days. So the United States was able to crank out ships just in large numbers, and not only lending them to the British, but using them for their own endeavors as well in the war. So Liberty ships, sort of the American economy at its height. Uh, these kind of prefab kind of ships. The war effort. We think about World War One. Woodrow Wilson had the war to preserve democracy. Roosevelt had what we called the Four Freedoms. He articulated this in speeches. So the Four Freedoms is a way of sort of bolstering the American war effort. Democracies at war aren't like dictatorships at war. Dictatorships at war can force you to go to war, whereas democracy, you have to sort of encourage people to go to war. So Roosevelt does this through what are called the Four Freedoms. So the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, of course, right out of the Bill of Rights. But freedom from want and freedom from fear, he adds to this. So this is articulated best by Norman Rockwell again, this illustrator, American illustrator, designed covers for the Saturday Evening Post. There's a Rockwell Museum out in Springfield, Massachusetts. I've been there. You can actually see these paintings there at this museum. So you have here freedom of speech, the man speaking his mind. Freedom of religion. I'm sorry. The praying here. Freedom from want, like a Thanksgiving dinner, and freedom from fear, putting your kids to bed, knowing that they'll be safe. These are very famous Rockwell illustrations. Just like the Rosie the Riveter was a very famous Rockwell illustration. It's art, using art to bolster the war effort. There's also the side effect of the erosion of civil liberties. Some of this is quite strange. You had, of course, the United States segregation, not only in the South, still. So you have this problem of the United States saying we're fighting evil, racist Germany, and meanwhile there's segregation in the South. They would segregate the military as well. And they did this in strange ways. Like blood banks were segregated. So they segregated African American blood from white blood. So if you needed blood, the African American blood was blood banked differently. So sometimes there was a shortage of blood from these blood banks because of the segregation. It seems kind of stupid because, I mean, it's not like, this is where racism is stupid. It's really stupid here because they're people, they're human beings, they're not different species, so it makes no sense. All that matters would be the blood type, but so they would segregate blood banks based on race. It was kind of stupid, but this is kind of a holdover of the Jim Crow era. Famously, the United States put in Japanese Americans in internment camps. These prison camps Basically, the idea was that Japanese Americans, many of them born in the United States, so they were American citizens. The idea was that they're actually going to be, because they're Japanese, they're actually going to be more. They're going to show their allegiance to Japan, not the United States. So we need to lock them up. They did this to German. We did this to Germans in World War One. There were internment camps. Very famous case was the Boston Symphony Orchestra conductor Carl Mook, placed in an internment camp in Georgia because he allegedly refused to perform the national anthem at a concert. So same kind of thing in World War II with Japanese Americans. I think George Takei has talked about this. You know him from Star Trek, has talked about the Japanese internment camps. I think he has experience with this, so himself, or ancestors. I don't remember if he did or if he had parents who were. This is very. It's a black spot on the United States record. So this typically happens in war. Those erosion of civil liberties. U.S. war tactics mostly rely on air power. There were two types of bombing. This is a way of ensuring quick victories. So you don't want to put a lot of boots on the ground to risk having what you had in World War One, where you had huge numbers of soldiers, huge numbers of casualties. So you had tactical bombing where you'd bomb, maybe you'd target like oil refineries or factories. It is with Tokyo going in with Tokyo's more of a terror bombing. We'll talk about terror bombing in a little bit, but tactical bombing, you'd bomb maybe factories for production and oil refineries, thinking that will weaken the economy, the war effort of the enemy. And then, of course, you have terror bombing. Terror bombing is area bombing. So you're actually taking out civilians. So this kind of runs in counter to the League of Nations, where you're not supposed to target civilians, but they end up targeting civilians. Famously, with the dropping of the atomic bomb, those targeted civilians. That was the ultimate terror bombing. So U.S. war efforts relies on air power. Famously, we have D-Day on July 6, 1944. The American-led invasion, the Allied invasion of setting up the Western Front. German fortification was pretty strong. There was called the Wall of the Atlantic. They had walls they had fortification up as far as Norway and Sweden down through France and Spain. Huge numbers of soldiers policing that front. So this looked to be a very daring effort. It's usually remembered as one of the more daring war efforts. So the Allies had planned, let's do an experiment to see if we can actually do this. I have a map here. What they thought would be the easiest place to invade would be in Calais here. It's right across. It's the narrowest part of the English Channel. The Germans, of course, figured this, and so they had huge fortifications in Calais. So you have Dieppe down here to the south. So there was this Operation Jubilee before Operation Overlord, the famous Normandy invasion, where they actually said, well, we don't want to waste too many troops, let's send in the Canadians. So the Canadians, there's huge Canadian forces in this, and they're pretty much obliterated. So it's let's send the Canadians in, and because maybe we'll just test to see what the fortification's like. So Dieppe, Operation Jubilee, Operation Jubilee, I have it there with Dieppe. And then with Operation Overlord, they actually move in down here to Normandy. It's a little wider beach area, and set up the Western Front. And it's very successful. I mean, it's bloody as hell. I mean, if you ever watch Saving Private Ryan, people with their guts hanging out, it's very disgusting, very dangerous battle. But it had reached Alsace by December of 1944. I'm going to stop it here. I'm going to finish this up. We're running out of time. I only get 15 minutes on these, so I'll do a part 2 to this video here in a little bit. So talk to you in a second.